Welcome back. In the previous steps, we use a little bit of use of JSX. We learned that you can return the JSX from a component and that is displayed as the view. And we wrote a few simple components where we wrote simple JSX. In this step, let's try and understand JSX a little more. We know that we are including JSX in a JavaScript file, right? So this is a JavaScript file where I'm actually writing some kind of HTML, which we are calling it as JSX, extension of JavaScript. So how does this code get converted to JavaScript code? Isn't that a good question to ask? The thing is, with the create React app comes bundled something called Babel. It's Babel. So if you do a Google search for Babel.js, so Babel.js, this is the thing which converts our JSX code into JavaScript code. Actually, the purpose of Babel is much bigger. Different browsers have different kind of support for all the JavaScript new features. So as a programmer, it is very difficult for me to write code which works on all the browsers. What I can do is I can write code using the latest JavaScript standard and use Babel to compile it to lower versions of JavaScript. That's what Babel enables us to do. It enables us to write code in the latest version of JavaScript and compile it or convert it to earlier versions of JavaScript. So if a browser does not support the latest version of JavaScript, we can use the earlier version of JavaScript to run the code in there. You can go here and click the try it out link. What we want to try now is try and write a little bit of JSX code. So what I'll do is I'll try and write h1 heading and /h1. Let's see what would happen. You can see it's getting converted into JavaScript code. What is happening in here is a method called React create element in the React API is getting called. The first attribute which is passed in h1 is actually the name of the node. The second attribute is actually the attribute. So if I say h1 class name is equal to something, let's not really worry about what it is, then you can see that an object with all the attributes. So this is basically a JavaScript object which is present in curly braces. The first parameter is the name of the element. The second parameter is the attributes, an object with all the attributes which are defined in here. Let's say I had another attribute is equal to, you'd see that that also is passed in as part of this specific object. And the last one is the child element. So what are the child elements which are present in there? Let's create a little bit more complex structure. So let's say there is a parent component and a closing tag for the parent component, and inside that let's say there is a child component, and let's close the child component out in here. Let's say there is some text in the child component. You can see how the JavaScript code for that is, right? So the entire child component is the third parameter which is passed in here. So React.create element parent component, comma, I don't have any attributes. If I have any attributes defined in here, let's say parent attribute is equal to 1 or something. It does not really matter what it is. So then it's passing the second one as the object, and then you can see that the third one is the element, the entire child element which is passed in here. So instead of test, let's say there is another child element in here. What would happen? Another child element / another child. Oops. What would happen? You can see that the entire this particular element becomes the third attribute to the create element for parent component. For the create element for the child component, the third parameter is create element including the another component thing. So basically what we are looking at is how your JSX gets converted into JavaScript code. I would recommend you to play around with this. Now, let's look at a few tips and tricks regarding JSX. One of the important things about JSX is, let's remove this and let's include h1 sum heading slash h1, and let's say I'm including another h2 slash h2. What happens? You can see that it's giving me an error. It's saying adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in a enclosing tag. You can only have one parent element. You cannot return two elements together. If you want to return two elements, you have to create a parent element around them. So I have to do something like this. So div slash div, oops, let me get the syntax right, and then I can actually use this. So this is number one. You cannot return two elements from a single JSX. JSX is like an expression. You can only just return one thing. In later versions of React, you can also use empty node. So I'm removing the div within the nodes. So this is kind of open node, empty open node. This is empty closed node. And you can see that this would still work. So this creates something called a React fragment. And within that, you can have two child elements. The other important thing about JSX is the fact that all nodes should be closed. So even though HTML allows you to have something like this BR, right? So this is, if you look at this, this is valid HTML and this is also valid HTML, but this is not valid JSX. In JSX, all nodes should be closed. So if I say A, and inside that, let's say I have a node B, I cannot close A first. It would give you an error. It should be properly closed as well. So in JSX, all the nodes should be properly closed. Now let's switch back to our app component. One of the things you would have observed in here is I'm returning it inside parenthesis. If you remove the parenthesis, let's just quickly remove the parenthesis and try and save it. You can see that there is an error. Cannot actually do something like this. If you want to return a JSX expression from a method, you should start the JSX expression right on that specific line. This would work. You can see that it works, but you cannot do this. So you cannot have an empty line and then define the JSX expression. And that's the reason why we put a parenthesis around the return value. This would help us to have a well-structured code. So this parenthesis in here is very, very important. Without that, the code will not compile. So now you'd see that everything is fine. The next important thing is that for custom defined components, you have to use a capital letter as the starting letter. So let's see this. So I'm saying third component, and I'm changing the third component also to small. What would happen? Let's save this. Oops, third component is not at all displayed. And if you do a right click view source, oops, actually I should have done right click inspect and go to console. The tag third component is unrecognized in this browser. If you meant it to render a React component, it says start with a capital letter, start with an uppercase letter. So you cannot do that. So you have to have a capital letter as the starting name of a custom component. Whether it's a class component or a function component, the name of the component should start with a capital letter. All the small letters are reserved for all the stuff which comes from HTML. We have h1, h2, div, a lot of things that are present in HTML, and all of them are what will use the small letters. The last important thing that we would want to understand is that whenever you use JSX, you need to have React in the imports. If you look at this specific class, we are not making use of React at all. So if you say search for React, this import is not at all used at all. Let's try and remove this import in, and let's see what would happen. Oops, it says React must be in scope when using JSX, right? So you have to import React in if you would want to make use of JSX in your component. So make sure that you are importing React in whenever you are using JSX. In this quick video, we started with looking at Babel JS, which is the one which converts our JSX into JavaScript. JavaScript is what finally runs on the browser. So Babel enables us to write JSX and it converts it into JavaScript. We learned the fact that all tags must be closed in JSX. We also looked at the fact that we cannot return two tags. If you want to return two tags, you have to enclose them in a parent tag, or you can create an empty fragment as we looked at earlier. We saw that if you have complex structure to be returned as part of your JSX, it's better to include it as part of the parenthesis. We saw that a custom component should always start with a capital letter. And we saw that React should always be in scope when we are using JSX. I'll see you in the next step. Until then, bye.